Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today we have another benchmark for you, and I'm not really sure how best to describe this one, other than to say it's a follow-up for those of you who watched the previous 7800X 3D with the RTX 4070 versus the 7600 with the RTX 4070 Ti. So yeah, if you watch that benchmark, again, I don't really know the best way to describe that one either, but if you watched it, I guess you know. But yeah, in short, we were asked in our Q&A series which of those two configurations would be the best for gaming, as they cost roughly the same amount. And of course, the answer was, it depends. And in that video, we clearly demonstrated exactly why that was. And a lot of you really seemed to enjoy it. So we received a lot of feedback and requests really to do more of that type of testing. So that's always a positive sign. And a lot of you did ask that we include the Ryzen 5 5600 with a high-end GPU. That was a heavily requested part. So yeah, we're going to do that in this video that I don't know how to easily describe. But before we do,
today's video is sponsored by MSI. Thinking of upgrading your monitor? Now is the perfect time, thanks to MSI's stunning new QD OLED gaming monitors. With 4K 240Hz and 1440p 360Hz options, there's something for everyone, whether that's fast-paced competitive gaming on the elite speed of OLED, brilliant HDR gaming on these bright, immersive, well-calibrated displays, or even creator work backed by a 3-year OLED warranty. There's tons of connectivity too, including KVM support. I've been very impressed with the performance of these MSI QD OLEDs, and I strongly recommend them as flagship gaming monitors that will satisfy your needs for years to come. Find out more on MSI's new range of QD OLED gaming monitors via the links in the description.
Okay, so whereas previously we had just 2 hardware configurations, we now have 5. Kind of got right into this one, and the results I think are pretty interesting. The mission here was to work out how suitable the Ryzen 5 5600 is to use with a modern high-end GPU, such as the GeForce RTX 4080, but I also wanted to have a look at a few other configurations. For example, can a Ryzen 5 7600 with, say, an RTX 4070 Ti deliver better performance, and how much faster would the 7800X 3D be? I suspect that there are quite a few of you running a Ryzen 5 5600 or a similar CPU, and you're wondering if the upgrade to a more powerful GPU will require an entire platform upgrade. Of course, it will almost certainly depend on the games you plan on playing and how you wish to play them, but the upcoming set of results should give you a really good idea of what to expect. For testing, we're of course using Windows 11 with the latest drivers and BIOS versions for each motherboard, and in total I've tested 8 games, which might not sound like a lot, but there is plenty of data to go over, so let's get into it. Starting with Avatar, which is a very GPU heavy game when using the ultra quality settings, we see that the Ryzen 5 5600 makes out really well. Sure, at 1080p it was up to 25% slower than the 7800X 3D, but once we jump up to the 1440p resolution, which I think is a more realistic configuration for this type of game using this sort of hardware, the 5600 is able to roughly match the 7800X 3D, and then at 4K performance is identical. In short, the Ryzen 5 5600 can drive up to 150 FPS on average with 1% lows just shy of 100 FPS, and at realistic settings this is enough to extract the maximum level of performance out of the RTX 4080. And I think for most of you is really more than enough performance to really enjoy the game. Moving on to Starfield, here we have a game that is much more demanding on the CPU. The Ryzen 5 5600, for example, can only drive roughly 70 FPS on average, and that meant at 1080p it was slightly slower than the 7800X 3D when using the RTX 4070. So the RTX 4080 really is wasted on the older Ryzen 5 part, as it should be around 40% faster, as demonstrated by the 7800X 3D. Now, moving up to 1440p, that does of course help, but even so, the 5600 is still limited to that same 70 FPS or thereabouts, which is the same level of performance you can expect from the RTX 4070 Ti when paired with a modern processor. In fact, the 5600 plus RTX 4080 combo was just 16% faster than the 7800X 3D and RTX 4070 combo, or 17% slower than the 7800X 3D using the 4080. In fact, it's not until we hit the 4K resolution that the performance becomes more GPU limited, and now the 5600 is able to match the 7800X 3D with just shy of 60 FPS. So based on that, you might conclude that the 5600 is fine for 4K gaming with an RTX 4080. And while sort of true, you might as well conclude that it's also fine for 1440p and 1080p if all you require is 60 FPS. But with a 70 FPS cap, it's not ideal for those of you interested in a high refresh rate experience, and in that case, you'd simply downgrade to the high preset in search of higher FPS. And that'll work with a 7600 or 7800 X3D, but with the 5600, you'll still be capped at around 70 FPS. Next up, we have The Last of Us Part 1 using the ultra quality preset, and at 1080p, the Ryzen 5 5600 does quite well, delivering on average 110 FPS, though the 1% lows are a bit soft at 79 FPS. In comparison, the 7800 X3D is 72% faster, and for those of you with high refresh rate displays, the difference here is going to be significant. Moreover, the 7600 with a 4070 Ti provided a higher frame rate / smoother experience, and in my opinion, the 7800 X3D with the RTX 4070 was also a better experience. But when we jump up to the 1440p resolution, the game does start to become more GPU bound, at least with the ultra quality settings, but even so, the frame time performance of the Ryzen 5 5600 wasn't nearly as consistent. And clearly demonstrating this, we saw just a 10% variance for the 7800 X3D and RTX 4080 combo between the average frame rate and 1% lows, whereas the 5600 produced a 45% variance, resulting in a poorer experience with more noticeable frame dips. Again, the 7800 X3D, or 7600, with the RTX 4070 Ti did provide a better experience overall. Then once again, by the time we hit the 4K resolution, the results are heavily GPU limited, and now the 5600 is able to match the 7800 X3D, albeit with just over 60 FPS. So again, most of you are probably going to want to tinker with those quality settings to increase the frame rates. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is another modern game that's very CPU and GPU demanding, especially with ray tracing enabled. Here we see that the Ryzen 5 5600 will limit you to around 66 FPS on average, with 1% lows of just over 50 FPS, making the 7800 X3D almost 60% faster on average, with a 75% increase to the 1% lows. The 5600 is so weak here that at 1080p you're looking at significantly better performance using either the 7600 with the 4070 Ti or the 7800 X3D with a 4070. Increasing the resolution to 1440p doesn't change much here. The 5600 is only able to match the 7800 X3D when using the slower RTX 4070, while the 4070 Ti configuration with the 7800 X3D and 7600 were 27% faster. Then if you want to maximize ray tracing performance in this title at 1440p, the 7800 X3D was over 50% faster when using the RTX 4080. Even at 4K, the 5600 is slightly slower than the 7800 X3D, but we're looking at sub 60 FPS frame rates here, and I personally would want them to be a bit higher. So I'd either play at 1440p, use upscaling, or reduce the quality settings for frame rates well over 60 FPS. Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered is surprisingly easy on CPU load, and as a result, the Ryzen 5 5600 still performs pretty great, allowing for just over 90 FPS with 1% lows of 60 to 70 FPS. And that's solid performance from the old budget processor, but for those of you currently looking to upgrade your GPU, there's little point going for something as high-end as an RTX 4080, and in fact, even the RTX 4070 might end up being a bit overkill. At 1080p, the RTX 4070 was good for 155 FPS, and was limited by even the 7800 X3D. Making the 4070/7800 X3D combo 65% faster than that of the Ryzen 5 5600. The 1440p results are basically the same, and even at 4K, the 5600 struggles, unable to get anywhere near the most out of the RTX 4080. Here the 7800 X3D was still 68% faster, while the 7600 or 7800 X3D paired with the 4070 Ti was still 17% faster on average, with up to 38% stronger 1% lows. And we know that Spider-Man Remastered with ray tracing enabled is very memory bandwidth sensitive, so DDR5 is certainly helping with those newer processors. Now, Call of Duty Warzone is a competitive online shooter, and typically speaking, those who play a bit more seriously will use competitive quality settings, as this not only boosts frame rates, but perhaps more importantly, makes it easier to spot enemy players. So that being the case, I'm not using the ultra quality preset like what we've done for the single player games, and instead dialed down to the basic preset. Doing so saw the Ryzen 5 5600 max out at 235 FPS, and that's a respectable and satisfactory frame rate for sure, and even the 1% lows were good. But if you demand more, and you best believe some gamers do, the 7800X 3D was 52% faster for the average frame rate, and 60% faster for the 1% lows. This also means that the 7800X 3D paired with the RTX 4070 is still faster at 1080p, while the 7600 and 4070 Ti configuration was even faster again. Now, increasing the resolution to 1440p sees the 5600 and RTX 4080 combo delivering similar performance to that of the 7800X 3D and 7600 combo when using the RTX 4070 Ti. So that means you're still looking at around a 30% performance boost with the 7800X 3D when using the same RTX 4080. And the 7800X 3D was still faster at 4K, though here the margin does shrink down to just 10% when comparing the average frame rate. So if you're playing at 4K, or only require 1% lows of just over 100 FPS with an average frame rate of around 150 FPS, the 5600 will be fine, though you're probably better off pairing it with something like an RTX 4070 Ti. Fortnite is a very CPU demanding game, especially late game, and here the Ryzen 5 5600 was limited to 178 FPS at 1080p with 1% lows of just 100 FPS. Now the average frame rate is okay, but those 1% lows are a real issue. I'm personally somewhat of a semi-serious competitive gamer. I certainly don't claim to be amazing, but when I play Fortnite, I require the frame rate to stay above 200 FPS in order to do my best work. I find that flick shots are just much harder to hit when dipping below that target, and this is something I've spent a serious amount of time testing. So for me, the 5600 would be unacceptable today, despite the frame rates overall being very high by single-player standards. The Ryzen 5 7600 also saw weaker than expected 1% lows, and that's despite a very strong average frame rate. Fortnite's a game that can be difficult to achieve a steady frame rate, but the 7800X 3D certainly does a better job of it, more than doubling the performance of the 5600, even at 4K. If you're predominantly a single-player gamer, these frame rates will no doubt seem excessive. I often hear inexperienced players comment on what, say, Counter-Strike players demand, but it really does make a difference, and you don't need to be a pro-level player for the advantage of these seriously high frame rates to be of benefit. So if you're a single-player gamer, don't make the mistake of thinking your performance requirements are universally accepted, because they're not. Speaking of Counter-Strike, or Counter-Strike 2, here are some results. Now, I haven't played Counter-Strike seriously for about a decade now, so I'm a bit out of touch on what's required here, but after some digging around forums and CS2 discussion boards, the general consensus seems to be that anything below 250 FPS starts to become suboptimal, with most of the serious gamers targeting 300 FPS or better. So very similar to my experience with Fortnite, and this probably applies to most competitive shooters. That said, the Ryzen 5 5600 looks to be very capable here, delivering almost 400 FPS at 1080p with 1% lows of over 200 FPS. That said, the RTX 4080 is capable of much greater performance, and really for 1080p gaming, the RTX 4070 Ti looks to be optimal, delivering just over 600 FPS on average in the hands of the 7800X 3D. Jumping up to 1440p sees the game naturally becoming a little more GPU limited, but even so, the 7800X 3D armed with the RTX 4070 is able to match the 5600/4080 combo. So I'd say the RTX 4070 is going to be a more optimal pairing for the older Ryzen 5 processor in this title. I'm not sure if many of the Counter-Strike 2 players game at 4K, but if you do, the RTX 4080 starts to become pretty handy, and here you will want a good CPU as the 1% lows of the Ryzen 5 5600 were quite weak, as the 7800X 3D was almost 50% faster. Now, the 8-game average data, which has been calculated using the geo-mean, is a bit pointless here, or perhaps risks being a bit misleading, because as we've just seen, it really does depend on the games you're playing and how you play them as to how well the Ryzen 5 5600 utilizes the GeForce RTX 4080. But out of interest, if we look at the average data, we see that at 1080p, the 5600 just can't push the 4080 hard enough, and will typically find itself too slow for even the RTX 4070. I'd say a 4060 Ti type product would be more suitable, which is similar in terms of performance to say a Radeon RX 6700 XT or GeForce RTX 3070, which are similar to an RTX 2080 Ti for reference. But if you increase the resolution to 1440p, it can typically step up a tier and would work quite well with an RTX 4070. Then at 4K, it's more at the level of a 4070 Ti, so while you can find instances where the 5600 will match the 7800X 3D with an RTX 4080, there are few and far between examples, and generally when we do see this, frame rates are very low anyway, so you'd probably reduce the GPU load for higher numbers, and that would separate the 5600 with more modern processors. So there you have it. I think for a 2-year-old mid-range to sort of entry-level product, the Ryzen 5 5600 stands up really well, but if you're looking for a graphics card upgrade, I wouldn't really recommend going past an RTX 4070 or Radeon RX 7800 XT. And more often than not, you'll just find yourself unable to fully utilize anything that's faster, a faster GPU that is. Of course, I am generalizing here. As we saw, this is very much game dependent and even quality settings dependent. Even so, if you're already on the AM4 platform, which you would be if you owned a Ryzen 5 5600, then I feel snapping up a Ryzen 7 5800X 3D for $310 US, along with a new graphics card, would be a smart move, if you're after that next level performance, of course, which I assume you would be if you're dropping $700 plus on a graphics card. All that said, I only recommend the 5800X 3D for those already on AM4. For everyone else, I recommend jumping on AM5 or maybe consider Intel's LJ1700 platform, though I do struggle to make sound arguments for going with LJ1700 at this point in time. Now, if you're a single-player gamer, you play games such as Avatar, Alan Wake 2, Starfield, and so on, you might be wondering why anyone would need more than 178 FPS in Fortnite, and that's a fair question. In that example, it was the 1% lows that were of most concern, but even so, there are multiple benefits to higher frame rates overall, assuming that you have the monitor and/or skill to take advantage of it. Moreover, you'll likely come up against some scenarios within the game that are more heavily reliant on the CPU than what I've tested here. The same also applies to Counter-Strike 2 and Warzone. There are also certainly more games that I could have tested that would show similar results to what we saw in the multiplayer titles, but this testing should have painted a pretty clear picture anyway. Overall, the Ryzen 5 5600 has proven to be an excellent buy for $200 US or less, and it still has plenty of life left in it yet, just not as a high-end solution, and of course it never was that anyway. But as I said at the start of the video, a lot of you are still using a 5600 and have asked me what kind of current generation GPU upgrade makes the most sense without having to upgrade your CPU, and some of you have also questioned if going as high as an RTX 4080 would work, again without having to spend money on a CPU or platform upgrade. And the short answer is, you'll want to upgrade your CPU. Anyway, I hope those of you who requested this follow-up content enjoyed it as much as the first video. And if you want to support the channel and get some cool perks in return, then we do have Floatplane, Patreon. Check either one of those out. They will give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind-the-scenes content, and Q&A. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.